people. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're zooming in from all around the world. It's great to have you back. It feels like it's been a longer break than it actually has, because I believe the last meetings of Minds was actually me and Paul very kindly and generously joined me, and we delved into some interesting debate about how we'd kind of got where we are in the world. And off the back of that, we had a ton of positive feedback, and people very, very typically wanted more of Paul, Dr. Paul Clayton. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Paul back with us today. And this topic in particular, behind the scenes, there is always a bit of discussion and debate about what it is that we're going to talk about. And Dr. Paul has spent so much of his time really delving into some quite provocative topics that we've got so much to choose from. And so there was a little bit of back and two on email from Paul and I until we arrived at this subject, which I think is suitably provocative to kick us off after the summer, which is why Paul hates supplements, if I've got that right, Paul. So Paul, without no real introduction required, really, I'm sure everybody who is here with us today knows exactly who you are and what you're about, and we can never hear enough from you. I will hand over the floor to you to explain to us why, particularly on a Zinzino forum, you want to announce to the world that you hate supplementation.
Right. Well, but perhaps hate is a little bit too strong of a word, but perhaps I should say I despise them. And the reason why I don't have any time for the supplement industry is that it is effectively a confidence trick. The people inside the industry know that their products are useless. They do, because they've seen the evidence, and yet it's a great business. I mean, let's start to break it down. What are the major sectors in the supplement industry? Well, the two largest would be the fish oil industry, and we're not a part of that really at all, because what we do not sell is commercial fish oil. But the fish oil industry in general, the global market, I think last time anyone measured it, it's worth approximately $12 billion. And you have to ask yourself why people buy into this, because you and I both know that the Cochrane collaboration that has looked at the evidence to support the use of fish oils has come up with a raft of meta-analyses which show conclusively that fish oil does not work. It does not protect against cardiovascular endpoints. It does not protect against neurodegenerative endpoints or ophthalmological endpoints, or really anything. Fish oil is a fabulous business to be in, and countless numbers of people all around the world will take fish oil religiously, especially in the northwest of Europe. The Scandinavians, I think, prefer fish oil to mother's milk, and they're all taught to drink it from birth. So it's based on faith and faith alone, because the evidence tells us repeatedly, consistently, fish oil doesn't do any good at all. And in that sense, I regard it as the modern equivalent of the medieval practice of carrying around the bones of the saints in your pocket, or a splinter from the one true cross. It's an article of faith. It is not supported by the science. Let's pick another, or the second most important sector from the supplement industry, and those are the A to Z projects, the multivitamins, multiminerals. Well, that's worth, I think, according to the figures, about 20 to 25 billion a year globally. So a huge market, lots of people are buying into this. And now we know that none of that does any good either. About 10 years ago, we had a set of studies and meta-analyses of the so-called A to Z products, and they concluded that these do nothing other than enrich the companies that produce them. They do not reduce the risk of cancer or heart disease or dementia or a death overall in men or in women. And very recently, in the last 18 months, a very large prospective trial and a huge meta-analysis arrived at exactly the same conclusion. I think that there are several reasons why supplements don't work, and I want to get into that in a minute, but it's very difficult to persuade people to wean themselves off these products because, as I said, I think it's faith-based. It's anxiety binding, and these are anxious times. The people who take supplements claim to feel better, but objectively, in terms of real world health outcomes, they gain no advantage at all. They sicken and they die in exactly the same way as people who do not supplement. Total mortality is unchanged with one exception, and that is if you take calcium supplements, in which case you're likely to die earlier.
Yeah.
And let's talk about why the supplement industry is so desperately flawed, why it is so completely ineffective. And as I said, the people who run these companies know that their products have zero or negative impact. They continue to sell them, and I find that unforgivable. So let's see why the supplement industry does so badly. Because in the wider context, I think we all know that the modern diet and lifestyle are really defective, that they're damaging. We know that they result in metabolic problems which are implicated in driving diseases, and therefore improving the situation using nutritional tools should make things better. But the supplement industry's products don't. Now, why is that? Well, I think that a lot of them are really poorly designed. And I think that that design reflects historical bias. It reflects an incorrectly Pasteurian view of the relationship between nutrition and health. That's a way of thinking that is more appropriate to pharmaceutical pharmacology. It is not for nutritional pharmacology. And if you wanted to be more cynical, you might suspect that one of the reasons why the supplements sell such poorly designed product is that many of the supplement companies are owned by drug companies, and their business model depends on vast numbers of us becoming chronically ill. They have no interest whatsoever in helping us to stay healthy with low-cost products, with low-cost supplements. And that might be a darker and additional explanation as to why so many of the supplements on the markets today are so badly designed.
Just to interject there, though, because I think some of my cynicism is a bit more deep-rooted. Do you not think that some of the bad design comes down to the fact that they're just really keen to produce a cheap product and create big margins and high turnover, and that what motivates them is not a solution-orientated position, but that they can take advantage of a health narrative, produce a very provocative and appealing cheap product, and make a huge amount of revenue?
No, you're exactly right. It's not personal, folks. It's just business. And I can say that from the inside because I've worked in the past with many of the very largest pharmaceutical companies. And more recently, I worked with the world's largest retailer of these types of products. And you're right. It's what Mallarmé, the French writer, called le trahison des clercs, the treason of clerks. All of these little people just wanting to make good quarterly returns for their brand or their portfolio of brands. And they know that they can do that by designing products that are at least familiar and hopefully cheap, with a healthy profit margin built in, even if the end result is not particularly healthy. So I think that there are lots of individuals who are involved in driving the machinery of this industry. But there are players, Colin, as I said before, who are higher up in those companies within the industry and who do understand that the products they sell do not work. And I've met them, I've had conversations with them, and off the record, they're quite open about it.
But if we look, though, because I do want to challenge a bit, because obviously my background in sport, and a real challenge that we face, and I actually think that people face this challenge in their day-to-day life, but we for sure face this challenge when we're developing athletes, is getting a sufficient amount of protein into the daily diet just through dietary methods. And that's where it was a big breeding ground for the supplement industry, certainly in the 90s into the early 2000s, which was this notion of making protein products. And in that area, actually, without too much intelligence or sophistication, you can make a product that makes a difference. So what are your feelings about that? Do you agree with the impetus around it? Do you think that there is a verifiable need for protein? Do you agree that can be an effective way that actually doesn't need that much intelligence? Or do you think that's just as guilty of the accusations that you place in other areas?
Well, the protein market is a very specialized part of the overall supplement market, and it really is aimed, as you say, more towards athletes and, of course, to the bodybuilding community, who are a very strange bunch of people altogether. I think that it has a role to play. If you want to bulk up, bodybuilding is your thing, then protein is clearly, key to that. I think that for most athletes, if you understand the biochemistry of food and the nutritional characteristics of food, I'm not sure that you need protein supplements there either. Having said that, I understand that the persuasive aspect of modern marketing has led many people to believe that you have to have a protein supplement. They talk about the importance of protein at the beginning of the day. Actually, I think that's a bit of a myth as well. Intermittent fasting programs have rather given the lie to that. But what can I say? We are up against a very large marketing industry that represents the financial vested interests of an enormously wealthy and powerful group of companies in our industry. And it's very hard, I think, to get our message across. And it's made harder by the fact that people do understand. Well, first of all, they've become very alienated from ordinary foods and from their diet. They have learned to associate foods either by commission or by omission with all kinds of health problems. And we know that poor diet has been established as the most important cause of early, which means preventable mortality. And we know that the post-transitional modern industrial diet is strongly linked to an increased risk of cancer and diabetes and heart disease, degenerative disease in general, accelerated death, all of that. And so we feel very naturally, well, if only we could find the antidote, the things that are missing. People are primed, I think, to look for supplements. But I think that we're barking up the wrong tree. We're still thinking in Posterian, or if you want to go back in time, Newtonian or Aristotelian terms. We're thinking in atomistically. Ultra-processed foods that are so important in the diet today, they have terrible nutritional values. They leave consumers overweight, low in most nutrients, they have chronic inflammation, they have dysbiosis, metabolically they're deeply compromised. And so the human herd is in a state now where it is largely being poisoned by commission and by omission. The supplements should therefore have a role to play, but the problem is that most of the supplements around are really far off target. In many cases, the manufacturers are still claiming that they can treat deficiency disease or at least depletion, but that war is over. Or they're pushing the latest, most fashionable extract, or as you say, they're simply trying to sell products with the highest profit margin. In all of these cases, they're still thinking in terms of magic bullets, largely, and I think that means that they're peering through the wrong scope. What are the top 10 selling supplements? Well, you've got vitamin D, as opposed to the fish oil and A to Zs. What comes after that? Well, if you look at the single supplements that come after that, in the top 10, you'll find vitamin D, vitamin C, B12, and vitamin K now as a late entrant. The trace elements, magnesium, calcium, and zinc, and then you've got the vein hope collagen. And all of these things have one thing in common. They don't work. They don't build bone. Calcium does not build bone. Even if you add vitamin D, it does not build bone. Building bone requires much more than that. They don't enhance immunity. They don't make you beautiful. They don't provide any health benefit. Now let's talk about calcium. I talked a moment before about how calcium supplements don't do anything except possibly increase the risk of death. Why do we take calcium? Because it's for bones, right? The idea was that because osteoporosis is so prevalent, you're losing calcium, but of course you're also losing magnesium and various other things. If we stuff you with calcium, we'll find a way to cram it back into the bone. The model is wrong. This is linear first order thinking, and that has no place in nutrition or in modern medicine. Why were you losing calcium in the first place? It's not like a reservoir that empties out and you fill back up again. The reason that you lose calcium or bone mineral density, and magnesium, and the phosphorus salts and everything else, is because the osteoid, which is the organic component, the matrix within bone, is degrading. That's what holds the mineral salts in place. If you're losing osteoid, you then lose the minerals, the calcium and magnesium. Simply by stuffing yourself full of calcium and magnesium, you will have no effect at all unless you concentrate on the osteoid and rebuilding that first. So what I'm saying is, put all those Aristotelian atomistic ideas aside, and we have to think in a more joined up kind of way. What does bone economics, if you like, what are the economics of bone minerals? How are they dependent on the economics of osteoid? What do you need to make osteoid? And there's a lot of things that you need. The idea that you can treat this very complex situation with a large dose of calcium and or vitamin D is laughable. And it's a model of, it's a way of thinking that is more to do with pharmaceutical pharmacology than nutrition.
So, I mean, that's an interesting comment to conclude that statement with. So let's have a look at that for a moment. Because the question that was occurring to me is that this information that you're making reference to is it's not exclusive. There's a widespread recognition and understanding of this to the point of pretty much consensus.
But you don't see it in the market. But you do not see it in the market largely. There are minorities players.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, Paul. So why is that? Because it can't be surely that the only people with noble intentions in the supplement space is us. Why isn't it that people aren't taking that road in?
Once you start to think in terms of rather more comprehensive nutritional programs, obviously the price point goes up. And this market is price sensitive. And the fact is that the people who have the worst risk of developing a chronic degenerative disease, a so-called disease of civilization, there's a socioeconomic gradient there. And the people who can afford to eat well and who are less at risk, they're the ones who can afford to buy the expensive supplements. People who are lower down than the pecking order, who actually are more at risk, are going to find it rather difficult to afford the more extensive and therefore more expensive pharmaconutritional programs that really will improve their health. There's that very basic economic issue is, I think, at the heart of it.
So then just to go back to the comment you made, which is more to do with the kind of pharmaceutical model of thinking with regards to increasing the intake of calcium, or whether it's magnesium or whatever, to address the situation. Just like, why would you brand that as a pharmaceutical approach to the problem? What's the joined up thinking there in that?
Well, the pharmaceutical approach pays at least lip service to the idea of monotherapy and specificity, very Pasteurian. The idea that you can address a single receptor or enzyme or metabolic pathway. That's at the heart of pharmaceutical pharmacology. And there are, as you know, historical reasons for that. You started off with the works of people like Pasteur, Koch, and Ehrlich, which gave rise to this concept of the magic bullet, an approach which is reasonably appropriate when you're dealing with microbes and diseases caused by microbes, specifically bacteria. And what happened was that concept became embedded into the foundation of the pharmaceutical model. And they still look to devise increasingly specific tools to address these very complex conditions, which, such as cardiovascular disease, dementia, whatever, which in fact are not diseases at all, not in the classic sense, they're syndromes. So let me give you an example of that, tell you what I mean. If you look at Parkinsonism, for example, it is not a disease. There are so many enzymes involved, so many neurochemicals, so many sequences inside the different groups of neurons and immune cells in the brain, which culminate in a collection of symptoms that we call Parkinsonism, that there are hundreds of entry points which will lead you to the same clinical presentation.
Mhm.
And these are all different fundamental diseases. They all have different causes. They may end up with a collection of symptoms that we have learned to call Parkinsonism, but it's not a disease in the way that cholera is a disease, for example, or tuberculosis, where you have a single input which reliably produces the clinical endpoint.
Mm.
These degenerative so-called diseases are in fact syndromes. They're wastebasket diagnostic categories. You can get to that endpoint from so many starting points. And that is why, for example, in Alzheimer's or in Parkinsonism, there are so many really good scientists working on a specific enzyme, a specific receptor, a specific gene, trying to develop tools which will treat Parkinsonism. And you know what? Every time they do those studies, they'll find a couple of people who respond really well. Then they go to a larger trial and it fails every time. And the reason is that if you have 1,000 Parkinsonian patients, you probably have 500, 600, 700 different ways in which the brain is actually going wrong. Whatever tool you use, if you use a precision tool, which is what pharmaceutical pharmacology is, you will only ever impact on a very small subset of the overall group of Parkinsonian patients who have the problem because of that specific lesion that you're addressing. Another way of looking at this is to take the historical perspective and look at the way in which the frequency of Parkinsonism has increased in the post-transitional era. Now, Parkinsonism has always been with us, but it has increased by leaps and bounds, particularly since the industrial age and the move towards industrial food. Lots of things are clearly going wrong. We have chronic inflammatory stress, we have dysbiosis, we have glycemic mismatch, we have type B malnutrition, we have the wrong proportions of electrolytes thanks to our modern diet and lifestyle. All kinds of people are now developing Parkinsonism who do not have, strictly speaking, hard genetic risk factors. They were the people who had Parkinsonism before. But now many more of us are becoming involved because we are so profoundly compromised by the modern diet and lifestyle. Now, the idea that you can treat this at a population level by throwing these very precise and very clumsy biochemical spanners into the enormous complexity of a self-referencing, stochastic human metabolism is on its face absurd. We're doing something very different at Zinzina. What we're doing is we're trying to remedy or neutralize, provide antidotes to the major pathogenic drivers that the modern diet and lifestyle create, and which we know are implicated in driving these complex collections of symptoms. Now, I'll be very controversial now and talk once again about the Parkinsonian patient that I've been working with for the last 5 years. This is a man who was then in his 70s. I think he's now in his early 80s. And he was a very, very, very intelligent person. He was a forensic accountant working at very high levels. And he started to develop the early symptoms of Parkinsonism, went to see his specialist, his neurologist who diagnosed Parkinsonism, and told him, well, we can perhaps slow the progress a little bit, but this is what's going to happen. Now, because I happen to know this gentleman, because he knows the work that I do, he came and talked to me and said, is there anything else do you think that I could do? And this was at a point when I was already thinking of pathogenic drivers and antidotes, and I put him on basically what then became the health protocol. And what has happened is that over the last 4.5 years, his symptoms have gradually reduced, and I was able to get to him at a very early stage before a lot of neuronal loss. And he went back to see his neurologist after a gap of 4 years, and the neurologist looked through his notes and said, scanned, first of all, tested my friend, and looked at his notes and said, what idiot diagnosed you with Parkinsonism? You don't have it. And my friend said, well, you did. True story, true story. And the guy said, well, well, clearly you didn't have Parkinsonism, but my friend still had anosmia. Now, that was one of the very first symptoms. And the consultant said, well, look, you still seem to have I can see why I made this mistake, because you've got this particular symptom. Well, maybe it's actually something else, but whatever you're doing, keep on doing it and go away, and I'll see you in a couple of years' time. And now what I'm really pleased to be able to report is that finally the anosmia, which was the first symptom to appear, has become the last symptom to disappear. And he can now once again smell the coffee, he can smell the sawdust, he's an extremely expert woodworker, and he can also smell the rising panic of his neurology consultant, who's a very eminent person who has a sound grasp of pharmaceutical pharmacology, and therefore cannot see beyond the shadows of the shadows on the wall of the cave. So when I talk about the idea of a monotherapeutic intervention, that is a very pharmaceutical mode of thinking. I was trying to explain to you that there are coherent historical reasons for that. We have to step outside that. And at Zinzino, that is what we have done. We have established a very different way of approaching dysnutrition and the ways in which the modern diet and lifestyle create these pathological syndromes. And what we're starting to see now is more and more people responding to our types of interventions in ways that I am now beginning to think of as management and perhaps even curative. Now, I understand that that is a very provocative statement, and the more outrageous the claim, the more substantial your evidence needs to be. We do not yet have substantial evidence. I'm presenting this to you as a hypothesis, a working model, and that, I think, is the direction that we are going to continue to go in, and to explore that and to provide further substantiation, which, as you know, we are now starting to do in our series of prospective, randomized, double-blinded and placebo-controlled clinical trials.
Which is true, and because we know each other well enough, that I very much see the red lights and hit the brakes whenever we start talking about cures, and I'm very big and dominated in the preventative space because, well, there's two reasons for that. I've got nothing against cures, but I think the problem that we have, Paul, and you'll be aware of this, is that too many people for too long have promised cures to people that are what are called alternative, because they're outside of the fully functioning medical model at the moment. They've failed to deliver. One of the reasons that I've had an inherent skepticism about the supplement industry and what's often referred to as the alternate therapy industry is that often when put to task and when assessed, there's a failure to deliver. So could I just say that's true of a great deal of pharmaceutical product as well. I totally agree. I completely, we're on the same page on that, Paul, 100%. And you've heard me say, I'm full of cliches, and you've heard me say this one before, that the definition of insanity is to repeat the same process and expect a different outcome. And I see that a lot under the pharmaceutical model, where people will confidently go back to the same prescription and go, but it didn't change anything ever. It was like, now that things have progressed and got worse, why do you think it's going to make a difference now? And also, when we look at populations at large, I think it's fair to say a lot of medication fails a lot of people, but that's a different debate, and maybe we can come back and have that as a standalone meetings of minds, and we'll have to be careful what we say in all honesty. But going back to this and this notion of curative, and where the supplement industry has placed itself in what it offers and what it promises, I have concerns over that. One of my initial concerns when I first became aware of Zinzino is this a company that is promising things that it can't deliver? But your experience is far more wider than mine in this space, for sure, and you've got a far greater global awareness of who operates in this space. So do you see a tide turning? Do you see that people will start to get on board and start to go, you know what, we can do this better, and we have to, because we're running out of runway of just failing to deliver? Or do you actually think that that problem is just getting bigger? Because if it is, that's actually a problem for us as well.
I think that the evidence now that the modern diet and lifestyle vastly increases the risk and the incidence of all the chronic degenerative diseases is really, it's no longer in question. And it's therefore really only a question, the only question that remains is, well, what is it about the modern diet lifestyle that does this, that is creating these problems? If we can identify them and remove those drivers, then we should be able to restore a public health profile which is more aligned with either pre-industrial public health profiles in the West, and you know that's one of my own areas of research, mid-Victorian England, or the type of health profiles that you see in vestigial groups, where the types of problems that predominate in developed societies today do occur, but at levels that are fairly consistently at 10% or thereabouts of the levels that we see now. Now that tells you right away that it is theoretically, if we could find the right tools, possible to reduce the burden of chronic degenerative health by around 90%. That's what we've got to play for. It's only a question of finding out what that is. Now, if you can prevent these diseases from progressing, it's really only a very short step from there to start thinking in terms of cure, because these diseases have very long preclinical phases. And if you can intervene at the preclinical stage so that the disease never becomes overt, is that prevention? Is it treatment? Once the symptoms have started to emerge, you don't necessarily yet have you haven't necessarily arrived at an event horizon. So for example, atheroma is forming. We can make that melt. We can make it disappear. We know that. We've seen that in our customers, but over in the medical space, people have seen that using very aggressive lipid-lowering techniques such as lipophoresis. We know that that's possible. We know that these early stages of diseases are reversible, i.e. curable. Once the atheroma has progressed to the point where you've had an infarct and the downstream tissue is dead, then our tools have no further application whatsoever. That's non-curative. So when I talk about cure, I'm being fairly specific and actually quite careful in how I use that specific term. And now that you know that, I would think that you would find the concept a little easier to accept. I would only say that the reason why we do not think of these NCDs as being curative is because the medical profession has persisted in trying to treat them with pharmaceuticals, which are not the appropriate set of tools to use. And if that's all you have to work with, you will always see your patients inevitably getting worse and dying. You then think, oh, it was inevitable. These are degenerative. You can't stop that. They're entropic. Well, now we know that's not true. If you use different types of interventions, it's very, very obvious that you can stop the early and preclinical stages. So I think that to actually talk about cure is not that big of a conceptual leap. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's a fair comment. But I think that and you've put that across quite elegantly. But the problem you've got is that, the average person, including my own on a day-to-day basis, has a far more simplistic version of what the term cure implies. When you put it across your way, then yeah, I'm far more on board and convinced. And in that way, when we talk a lot, for instance, if we were talking about type 2 diabetes, we talk about pre-diabetes and the reversibility of it. And I guess under those terms, you would still see that as a curative component. That reversibility is that we're seeing the early onset of the condition of the disease, and we can actually restore and reverse that. So that in itself is curative. And I think that under those terms is accurate and it's fair. I think the problem that we have, which is similar to a lot of the things that we do at Zinzino, is we have to explain a lot to people for them to fully understand what our intention and what our sentiment is. And then because there is an industry at large that is making our task harder, because they talk about cure in the same way that the pharmaceutical model talks about cure, and they promise a lot of things they can't deliver on, that's probably why I get more prickly about going into that ground, because I'm far more sensitive to the issues around that and where there's been failures on it. But if I can, just on this note, I just want to take you a little sidestep a little bit, because I think where you're leading this is really interesting. So I just want to consider it from another point of view, because the preventative component of what we do. So let's assume that somebody is so far non-symptomatic and not in an advanced or progressed stage of developing any kind of condition, and starts to just make a better decision, better course of action with regards to the products they consume and the foods that they start to avoid and reduce down on and start to minimize. And that to me is full effect preventative. In that space alone, what are your considerations of the potential harm that certain types of available supplement can create when somebody thinks they're doing the right thing?
It's perfectly possible to overdose, and people do. I would only say that the therapeutic indices of most supplements are far larger than they are for most pharmaceutical products, and I'm including the OTC products in there. Yeah, if you take vast doses of vitamin C for over long periods of time and you don't hydrate properly, it's very likely that you'll develop a kidney stone. If you take enough selenium tablets, you'll develop selenotoxicosis. Yeah, you can poison yourself, you can kill yourself by eating too much salt or by drinking too much water. And we know cases of that where that has been done. Paracelsus, Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, one of my many medical heroes, and the father of toxicology, said, as you well know, everything is a poison. It is just a matter of the dose. So broadly speaking, the supplements are in a very much safer space. The therapeutic index, the difference between therapeutic dosage and toxic dosages, you're talking generally in terms of many multiples. And if you try to measure supplement toxicity in terms of people who have had either serious adverse effects or who have died as a result of inappropriate and excessive supplementation, you can find them. But you can probably count them on the fingers of a couple of hands. Whereas if you were to compare and contrast that with the numbers of people who are harmed or killed by medical and specifically pharmaceutical interventions, I mean, we're talking there about one of the leading causes of death. So it's very hard to compare the two. I mean, there is really very little comparison. But can you theoretically damage yourself by taking too many of the wrong supplements? Of course. I wouldn't argue that at all.
So that's interesting. And it's at times like these, Paul, I'm going to be honest, I always feel like I need to hold you back a little bit, but I'm not going to this time, because I have a growing concern, and this happens a lot. So we'll talk to somebody about their vitamin D supplementation, and someone will go, "Oh, you can take too much vitamin D," and this train of thought, I've had people say it over vitamin C. Oh, you can take too much vitamin C, you can take too much. I have to be careful as well. My suspicion here is that this false caution, this raised, the problem we've got is people aren't taking enough. That's the real problem. A billion people attributed to being, vitamin D deficient. 6.3 billion according to the World Health Organization in an omega-3 deficient state. So the problem we've got is people aren't taking enough. So do you think that this seed of thought, this make people concerned about the too much, which isn't really a problem for the vast majority of people, do you think that's been engineered by a certain faction? Do you think that that's been dropped in and that narrative has been led by a certain corner of the market that wants people to be scared of the wrong thing?
Colin, your paranoia is showing. I'm not sure I would agree with that. And I think that one of the reasons why we tend not to look at this in a productive way is because we're using the wrong risk assessment models. Now, if you are going to introduce a new pharmaceutical, you'll do your safety testing, you'll do your toxicology, and you will work out, well, where are the doses where adverse effects start appearing, and what is the difference between that and therapeutic range? You do your differential calculus, you try and work out how many people we're going to harm as opposed to how many people we're going to be able to help. And you arrive at a certain algorithm. With nutrients, it's really very different because this kind of unidirectional risk analysis model doesn't work. Because as you said, there is another side. you have vastly greater numbers who are at risk because they're not taking enough. Here, vitamin D is singled out, and of course we know that hypovitaminosis D is extremely worldwide, very, very common, particularly in people who have darker skins, who are overweight, who live in the higher latitudes, all of those sorts of things. And that constitutes a degree of risk all on its own. We need to develop bidirectional risk assessment models and set that risk against the much smaller degree of risk that is associated, and we shouldn't deny that or conceal it, with significant overdosing of vitamin D. But the risk models to do this appropriately haven't yet been developed. Nobody uses them. So I would say that there is a kind of a methodological problem here that is distorting the picture. And, even although I like to bash the pharmaceutical industry and the people, the kinds of people behind them, I'm not sure that they're necessarily the largest problem here.
So where does it stem from then? Because it's so common, it's such a commonplace mindset that given the fact that we are so stacked in the opposite direction, which is towards the lack of sufficient nutrient supply, whether it's vitamin D or whatever you want to list, because this is so systemic, this is such a common response that people will go, oh, you can have too much, you can have too much. So where, if not engineered, where do you think this mindset has become manifest?
Well, okay, I'll go along with you to the extent that I think that some of the regulators are happy to push that particular story. But then, if you're a bureaucrat and a regulator, what is the first thing? What is the bureaucrat's first commandment? Cover your ass. There's a degree of risk here, however theoretical. They don't have to worry about the hypovitaminosis D story. That's not their problem. They're concerned with people only on the other side of that risk assessment model. And so that's where they focus. And they don't want any, case to occur on their watch. That's what they try to protect against. Now we come back to this problem that I was talking about, that I think they're using an overly simplistic risk assessment model. It's unidirectional, it should be bidirectional, but no one is looking at risk in that way yet.
Yeah.
Can I come back to vitamin D though? Because you raised an interesting point. Hypovitaminosis D is a vast problem, and people are saying, oh, it increases the risk of dementia, autoimmune disease, and God knows what, increases the risk of COVID is the latest thing. And so then unscrupulous supplement or naive supplementers and supplement companies come in and say, oh, take more vitamin D, it'll resolve all those problems. It won't. It won't. That is completely false logic. The people who are ill and who have low levels of vitamin D have terrible general nutrition. They're low in all kinds of things. They're multiply compromised. And the idea that you can take this train wreck, this under-maintained system, grotesquely under-maintained, and resolve all the problems with a single specific input, whether it's vitamin D or whether it's omega-3, is ridiculous. Again, that is a carryover from the pharmaceutical Pasteurian concept, and it has no place, and it should have no place in pharmaconutrition or indeed in public health.
But don't you think though, because there's something of a little bit of a contradiction in that, in as much as there was some compelling data from the States in 2020 that I wholly subscribe to the notion that the point they were attempting to make was the train wreck, as you've described it, and the fact that we had people who were compromised from a nutritional point of view, full stop. And what they did, and I think this is where some of the vitamin D narrative came from, and I've even made reference to it, is that they looked at severity of symptoms and how that correlated to vitamin D status. And they said, look, like there's a clear correlation that those with the most severe symptoms were the most severely depleted or deficient in vitamin D, and those with greater vitamin D, typically had lower severity of symptoms. But if you read that paper in full, it wasn't solely about vitamin D. It was using vitamin D as an example nutrient in the context of, we've got a society that's sick, they're obese, they're developing type 2 diabetes, cancer.
Right.
And
You're talking. You're talking about the Borscht paper, aren't you?
That's right.
Yeah. No, I read that too. And you're absolutely right. These people are multiply compromised. But the idea that you can resolve the issue by pumping them full of, one of the many things that is missing or is going wrong, it's just philosophically wrong. It's completely naive. We don't work like that. When people come to see us or end up as fodder in one of those types of research projects, they're like grotesquely under-maintained cars. Nutritionally, they're a terrible place. The modern diet and lifestyle leaves us defective in so many parts of the metabolic network, which is, as I said before, extremely stochastic. It's self-referential. The idea that a single type of input, whatever it is going to resolve all that is wrong. It's wrong on its face. It is completely wrong. So yes, I read the Borscht paper. I enjoyed it. But the way that has been translated at the general public level is take more vitamin D, it'll make you safe, it'll resolve that problem. No, that doesn't work.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we've really tried and worked hard to dispel that notion, and that we've tried to place vitamin D in the context of, I mean, even the way we place it in the product. Yes, we have an individualized approach, but our individualized approach is about top up, not strategy. And I fully get behind that, and I know you do too. And these are key nutrients that we can test for and give us some level of indication of what's going on. But given the fact that we've got less than 10 minutes left on our chat today, I'd like to just steer this right back to really, so we can have some concluding comments about really looking forward now. Paul, I'd be really interested to know your thoughts as we move forward. A lot has changed. I've noticed, without putting any names to it, that there's been a growth of new supplement companies who are certainly promoting a different narrative. They're using a lot of what I might call the right terminology. In some areas, I've looked at products and I've been a bit more convinced or less convinced. But what do you see? Because people might not believe this, but there's a benefit to us when more industries start to do it right, because that actually benefits us, because it gets people thinking the right way. But what are your thoughts when you look at the landscape now of the supplement industry? And if you could gaze into that crystal ball, what do you think is going to shape up over the next decade?
Well, I'm somewhat optimistic about some of the new companies that are getting into this space. And I do think that the debate is now being couched in a slightly different way, which I feel is likely to be more productive. Without wanting to be too egotistical about this, I think what we have been doing at Zinzino has helped that debate to develop. I think we've played a small part in that. Mm-hmm. If you want me to look a little further ahead into the future, I would say that given that we're clearly in the early stages of a global recession, the current models of healthcare and healthcare delivery, which is so expensive and so inefficient, we're running out of the funds needed to support them. The numbers of people who are sick and requiring medical health are so great that this kind of pharmaceutical post hoc crisis management model of administering health can no longer be afforded. We're bankrupt. We have to find more cost-effective ways. And that really means you have to go down the road to prevention. And when it comes to prevention, pharmaceuticals are far too toxic to be used indiscriminately at the public health level. The only way you can approach improved public health through preventative strategies, the only way is through lifestyle modification. And we're talking about physical exercise, and we're talking about nutrition. So the future is ours. Tomorrow, at the risk of sounding perhaps a little bit too certain of myself, the future, tomorrow is ours.
Interesting. I generally tend to agree. And I think that what we've got lined up ahead of us is a huge pivot point, where I do see that there's been such a kind of and a bit of a pressure cooker effect that's made people think of health in different ways. And that's led to actually some good questioning from the average person on the street,
Yes.
which I welcome, which is a good indication. There's two questions I've picked up in the chat that I'd like us to finish with. One, I'm going to ask you.
Could I make one comment before we get into that, Colin?
Yeah.
You referenced COVID a minute ago, and I think that COVID has had a huge impact on the way in which people think about health. The utter failure of masking social isolation, and really the very substantial failure of the experimental mRNA vaccines has led to a crisis of confidence in the medical profession. People are questioning and doubting the regulators, the NIH, CDC, FDA, EFSA, in a way that they've never done before. The medical profession has lost a great deal of credibility, a great deal. And people have, I think, as a result of that, begun to focus rather more on self-management. How can I improve my own risks? How can I reduce my own vulnerability? What can I do to make my chances better going forward? Because the medical model is so very deeply flawed. That, I think, again, is one of the reasons why I believe that what we are doing is part and parcel, a significant part of the next generation model of public and personal healthcare. Now, having got that off my chest, you had a couple of questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's what time we're on, because that's actually a really powerful way to finish it. I think there's a lot in that. And I think that the outcome of today is clearly that there's at least 2 more times that you and I could re-meet and discuss these topics of further depth. But I think we might need to consider how we do that. But I do find that a fascinating observation, and I agree. And in fact, there are statistics, some of which were captured by the WHO, that showed an increase in health centricity in the wake of COVID, that people started to want to be more empowered about managing their own health because of what they perceived as limitations. So I find that interesting. But there's 2 questions I want to draw to attention. One, I'd like you to answer because I'm interested to know your response, and one I'm going to respond to because I want to get something clear. First of all, synthetic vitamins in supplements. Give us your take on those in a nutshell, Paul.
Well, it depends on the complexity, the structural complexity of the vitamin. If you're talking about something as simple as ascorbic acid, then natural and synthetic are, they're identical. If you're talking about more complex molecules, which display stereoisomerism, so you have, left-handed and right-handed versions of the molecule, then clearly there may be substantial differences between natural and synthetic. And when it comes to those types of vitamins, then I'm going to go for natural, always natural, all the time.
Yeah, great answer. And my only contribution to that answer is I just dislike the terms natural versus synthetic because it's far more nuanced for the exact reasons that you've just described. Yeah. And then lastly, a question that I'd like to respond to before we head off, because it ties in perfectly with what we were talking about. And in fact, the quote that you cited only moments ago, someone's asked, can you overdose on balance oil? Yes. You can. Everything is poisonous. It all depends on the dosage. Take the recommended dosage. Work closely with any alteration that you make with that. You can overdose on anything. So please do not overdose on balance oil.
If you take that too far, you'll become immunosuppressed and hemophiliac. So don't do it. Colin, before we close, can I plug my website? And because I see we have almost 1,000 people attending, and even if only half a dozen of you go and join the website, that'll double my readership. So it's drpaulclayton.eu, Dr. Paul Clayton, all joined up, .eu. Come and have a look and see what I'm obsessing about at the moment, and let me know what you think.
And I want to encourage people doubly to do that, and I'll tell you why, because repeatedly, people will approach me, Paul, and they'll say, we love the chat you have with Paul, and stop holding him back. So folks, if you want the non-held back version of Paul, go to that page. It's fascinating. It's a great read. So please do that. But on that note, as we approach the hour, first of all, I want to thank you, Paul, for being here, for sharing your wisdom, your insights, your knowledge, your expertise, and your opinions with us. It's always valued and it's always food for thought. So I cannot thank you enough. Secondly, I'd like to thank that near 1,000 people. I think we were up to about 981 at one point. For being with us today. The summer is gone. We're moving into the autumn. We're going to have more talks. We're going to set up for September. We're going to bring along someone who will announce soon so we can have another engaging debate. I'm going to try as hard as I can to get Paul back on before Christmas. But I'd like to thank you all for being here, for your questions, your contributions, your participation, the team for putting this together. And we all look forward to you staying well, and being with us at the next meetings of minds. So until then, we'll sign off. Thank you again, Paul. Thanks to everyone. We'll see you at the next one.